Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1. The Caldwell place sat at the far end of Sycamore Lane the way old money always does, pulled back from the street, guarded by trimmed hedges and tall pines that mirrored nothing but themselves in the glass. It looked calm, proper, untouched by worry. Inside, on the evening of December 5th, Diane Caldwell drifted from room to room, switching on lamps. It wasn't even 5 yet. The sky still held a dull winter glow, reluctant to surrender. She'd been turning lights on since lunchtime, as if darkness were something that could sneak up early if she wasn't vigilant. Richard found her in the dining room, standing inches from the china cabinet. Her palm rested against the cold glass. The silver inside gleamed, recently polished again, for no one in particular. When he placed a hand on her shoulder, her body jolted like he'd startled her awake. A sound came from upstairs, something small but solid hitting the floor. A book maybe, a shoe. The noise lingered too long, echoing in a way that made the house feel hollow. Richard opened his mouth to laugh it off, to offer logic, tradition, old folklore passed down and exaggerated over centuries. The explanation felt thin even before he spoke it. Diane turned toward him. Her eyes had that distant shine again, the same look that had settled into them days ago, ever since she found the book. She'd been clearing the attic, driven by a restless need to organize things that didn't matter. That's when she uncovered the box, her grandmother's things, letters, photos, keepsakes, and wrapped in brittle yellow paper dated decades earlier, a narrow book with a cracked leather spine. The title, barely legible, spoke of winter legends from the mountains overseas. Richard remembered opening it at the kitchen table. The first illustration stopped him cold, a creature with curved horns and heavy chains, a basket slung across its back. Inside the basket, a child's face twisted in terror, fingers gripping the wicker as if it might give way. The words beneath described judgment, punishment, and how certain children were chosen. That night Diane read to him, paragraph by paragraph, her voice softened, thinned, until it faded entirely. She stood up mid-sentence and walked away, leaving the book open like it was breathing. Now it lived on her nightstand. Richard had caught her reading it in the dark, tracing each line with her finger, as though repetition could make the words safe or permanent. "Lucas is upstairs," she said quietly. They both understood what that meant. Their son was in his room. They were down here. The space between them felt like protection, though neither could explain why. "I know," Richard said. "We checked on him already." "Again," she whispered. "We did not long ago." She nodded, but her feet stayed planted. From above them came the familiar noise of a video game, bright electronic sounds, harmless and cheerful, echoing through the floorboards. Richard recognized it instantly. He knew the room. He knew the rhythm of their evenings. But Diane tilted her head, listening intently as if another sound threaded through the noise. Something faint, something meant only for her. The house around them hadn't changed. The walls were the same. The furniture sat where it always had. Yet everything felt subtly wrong, like a place remembered imperfectly, as if the home they trusted had begun, quietly, to watch them back. Richard knew the layout of the house so well he could have walked it with his eyes closed. Every corner, every stair, every creak belonged to him. Yet lately, the air inside it had changed. It felt alert, observant, as though the rooms were no longer empty when they weren't occupied. The thermostat glowed a comfortable 72, but Diane had wrapped herself in a cardigan over her sweater. Richard, without realizing it at first, had checked the front and back doors 3 separate times that day. Not because he'd heard anything, just because his hands seemed to move on their own. Lucas had always left damage behind him, the way some storms do without announcing themselves. At school, there were the misunderstandings. The Brenner boy with the fractured arm, Lucas said they collided while running. Others said otherwise. The small fire in the science lab, no proof, the administration insisted, even though everyone noticed Mrs. Haversham's missing cash during conferences. When the money surfaced later in Lucas's backpack, he explained it calmly, convincingly. He'd found it outside. Planned to return it. Richard remembered how easy it had been to almost believe him. At 14, Lucas had a face that should have opened doors. Symmetrical, handsome, empty of obvious tells. Instead, classmates edged away from him in the halls. Invitations dried up. Parents offered polite excuses when Diane tried to schedule visits. 2 years ago, the Caldwells stopped inviting friends over entirely, quietly retiring their dinner parties after what happened with the Harper family's cat. No one ever said it out loud again. Diane mentioned canceling the Christmas gathering planned for the next evening. Why? Richard asked. She couldn't give an answer without saying the thing neither of them wanted to name. The food was already paid for. The caterer booked. Calling it off would mean admitting that something inside their perfect home, inside the life they'd built so carefully, was fractured beyond easy repair. Then the sounds from upstairs died. No game music, no buttons clicking, just silence. The house seemed to pull inward, as if holding its breath. "Where Timmy?" Diane asked. "In his room," Richard said, "studying." "Always studying," she murmured, relief trembling beneath the words, like someone gripping a floating plank in rough water. Timothy was 12, smaller than his brother, softer in every visible way. His report cards came home with handwritten praise from teachers who didn't have to try that hard. On weekends, he volunteered without complaint. The coat drive last winter had been his idea, standing in the cold outside the grocery store, smiling earnestly as strangers dropped donations into his box. Older women would stop Diane to tell her how lucky she was, how rare a child like that could be. Sometimes Richard wondered if Timmy's kindness wasn't innocence at all, but adaptation. Children learned quickly how to survive inside families. If one child absorbed the shadows, maybe the other learned to shine brighter to compensate, as if balance itself were a form of protection. Upstairs, somewhere beyond the ceiling, something shifted, and Richard found himself hopping, quietly, desperately. That goodness really could outweigh everything else. Timothy's kindness wasn't a trick of contrast. It wasn't something he'd learned just to survive the space his brother occupied. He was good in the quiet, undeniable way that doesn't ask to be noticed. He had to be. At last, Diane stepped away from the china cabinet and drifted toward the back window. Night had settled in fully, though Richard couldn't remember seeing it arrive. The glass caught her reflection and held it there, washed pale, mouth drawn tight, eyes focused on something far beyond the yard. When she spoke, it was with the careful tone of someone repeating a thought she'd already rehearsed too many times. She said she'd been reading again. The thing from the stories, the one that came on December nights. Did he know what parents used to do long ago? Richard stayed silent. He recognized that look. She was going to say it whether he wanted to hear it or not. They would leave their children's shoes outside the door on the 5th of December, she said. Her breath left a faint cloud on the glass. If the child had behaved, the morning brought sweets and small rewards. If not, something else arrived. Something that carried switches. Something that dragged the disobedient away in a basket down into darkness. Richard tried to interrupt, to ground her, to pull her back into the room. She didn't stop. She asked him if fear had ever truly shaped a child into goodness, if terror had ever fixed what was broken. They both knew the answer. Lucas had been seeing professionals since he was barely old enough to understand why he was there. One after another, each eventually circling the same careful suggestion that he might need more than what a family home could provide. They tried medicine, then schedules, charts taped to the refrigerator, rewards promised, consequences enforced with calm voices and shaking hands. None of it made a dent. Every effort dissolved against the same empty stare, as if nothing they did ever reached him. Diane had exhausted every version of herself in the process. Gentle mother, firm parent, patient listener, unyielding authority. She read manuals, joined groups, and spent countless nights awake, replaying the past, searching for the exact second she'd ruined everything. Richard watched the weight of that search carve her down, watched her become someone who startled easily and cleaned obsessively, as if order might still be salvaged somewhere. And all the while, Timothy flourished. It was as though goodness had pooled inside him, overflowing to make up for what his brother lacked. Teachers adored him. Other parents specifically asked for him by name. The church highlighted his volunteer work after he gave up his break to help build homes for strangers. He said thank you without being reminded. He listened with a seriousness that felt far beyond his years. Sometimes, when Timmy spoke, Richard was caught off guard by how deeply he seemed to understand people. Looking at him, it was impossible not to hope. And looking at Diane, reflected in the dark glass, Richard felt the quiet fear underneath it all, that hope might be the most fragile thing in the house. Only a week earlier, Richard had walked into the kitchen after school and found Timmy standing at the counter, quietly making tea. The kettle had just clicked off. The boy explained it without prompting. His mother seemed overwhelmed, and he thought a warm drink might calm her. He drizzled honey into the mug with deliberate care, watching it dissolve. Something inside Richard eased. The tightness in his chest gave way to gratitude, to a sudden, almost painful love. He opened his mouth to praise him, and then he saw it. Just for a heartbeat, just before Timmy lifted his eyes. It wasn't worry on his face. It wasn't kindness. It was something sharper, a flicker of private fulfillment. The look of someone observing a sequence fall neatly into place, and then it was gone. Timmy smiled, bright, sincere, exactly the way a good child should, and Richard told himself he was tired, imaginative, looking for shadows where none existed. At least one of their sons was fine, he thought. At least something in their lives had gone right. Now back in the dining room, Diane's breathing filled the quiet. The house felt compressed around them, as if the walls were inching closer. The night stretched ahead in predictable stages, Lucas picking at his food in silence, Timmy asking thoughtful questions about homework, the slow march toward bedtime and the fragile ceasefire of sleep. Tomorrow would bring the Christmas gathering. Guests would arrive. Compliments would be exchanged. They would play their roles flawlessly beneath tasteful decorations and warm lighting. No one would say the word that hovered over everything. No one ever did. Diane broke the silence carefully. She thought the boys should stay downstairs tonight, both of them. Air mattresses in the den. Make it feel like a game, like an adventure. Richard scoffed and called it unnecessary. She turned back toward the window. Their reflections floated in the dark glass, pale and unreal. Is it, she asked quietly. He wanted to argue, wanted to be rational, but the objections slipped away before they could form, because something about this night felt off. The house shifted inside the way it always had, yet every creak sounded deliberate. The corners held shadows that had always been there, but tonight they seemed heavier, as if they were paying attention. He told himself it was paranoia, a story fed by her fixation, by an old legend that had burrowed into their thoughts and refused to leave. Just nerves, just exhaustion. "I'll talk to Lucas," he said at last. "Before bed, one more warning." Diane laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It broke short, brittle, like something snapping under pressure. A warning about what? Richard never got the chance to ask. Diane had already swept from the room, her footsteps quick and sharp on the hardwood. He was left alone, surrounded by gleaming furniture and carefully framed photographs. Tiny faces frozen in time, Luca's and Timmy as toddlers, teeth missing, innocence in their eyes. A family portrait from 2 Christmases past, everyone smiling. Yet Richard felt the hollow ache of a man who had built something beautiful only to watch it decay from within. Upstairs, the electronic bursts of Lucas's game resumed. Richard glanced at his watch, 5:47. The night was still young, but the house had shifted. He wandered through the first floor almost on autopilot, checking windows he already knew were locked, straightening curtains that didn't need straightening. In the kitchen, Diane had begun dinner. Vegetables chopped neatly, chicken thawing in the sink, every utensil in its rightful place. Everything was under control, or so it seemed. Then the back door rattled. Richard froze, hand pressed to the counter. Another jolt against the frame. Not wind, too deliberate, too rhythmic. He crossed the room and pressed his face to the window. The backyard lay empty. Harsh white from the security light cut through the darkness. And the gate, it hung open. He was certain he'd locked it that morning. Certain. Stepping into the December cold, Richard felt the air wasn't right. It carried no hint of pine, no faint smoke from chimneys. Something older, something raw and ancient lingered beneath. He walked across the frost-hardened grass and slammed the gate shut, latching it twice. When he turned back, Timmy was at an upstairs window. The boy stood frozen, pale in the lamplight. His eyes locked onto Richard with an intensity that made a cold line slide down his spine. No wave, no expression, just that unblinking gaze like he was being measured, cataloged, evaluated. The moment stretched, heavy and strange, before Richard lifted his hand in a hesitant wave. Timmy mirrored him, then finally turned away. Inside, Diane's voice floated down the stairs, calling them to dinner. They gathered around the table like actors in a staged family portrait, each playing a role in quiet dysfunction. Diane set out the fine china, a ritual of control, and served the chicken with hands that trembled ever so slightly. Lucas slouched, picking at his food with deliberate disinterest, a storm of defiance wrapped around his shoulders. Across from him, Timmy ate with measured precision, careful and unassuming, the embodiment of balance in a house teetering on the edge of unease. Timmy moved deliberately, taking measured bites, occasionally glancing at his mother with a look of quiet, genuine concern. "Mrs. Collard called today," Diane said, her voice bright in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. She wanted to thank Timmy again for helping her carry groceries last week. Timmy shrugged it off. "She shouldn't have to manage all those bags herself," he said simply. "I just walked her to the door." Diane hesitated, then whispered that he reminded her of her own grandmother. Her eyes shimmered with quick, helpless tears. Richard noticed Lucas watching, his face a closed door. Was it contempt? Indifference? He couldn't tell. The boy's expression revealed nothing, locked and opaque. Richard asked about school. "It's fine," Lucas muttered. "Tests, probably." "And your assignments," Richard pressed. Mr. Hendricks had called. 3 of Lucas's last tasks hadn't been turned in. Lucas shifted a piece of chicken from one side of his plate to the other. "I'll do them when I feel like it," he said, voice flat. The words landed like a quiet challenge. Richard felt the tension coil in his jaw, felt the familiar dance begin. The escalation, the warning, the anticipation of punishment. Lucas's indifference, Diane's suppressed worry. It was a performance they had repeated countless times, always ending the same way. But before Richard could react, Timmy leaned forward. "I'll help you catch up," he said simply. Lucas finally looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're my brother," Timmy answered. No lecture, no judgment, just the quiet force of truth. The weight of that simplicity hit Lucas like an accusation. His face flickered, something subtle, hard to name. But then he returned to his usual blank neutrality. "I don't need help," he said, less venomous than usual. Timmy nodded and went back to his meal as though nothing had happened. Diane made a sound that was half suppressed sob, half relief. Richard found himself staring at his younger son, at the calm radiance of goodness that seemed to emanate from him like warmth from a stone. For a moment, he was struck with awe. How had they created this child? What miracle had shaped Timmy, while Lucas seemed to absorb all the darkness in the household? The meal continued in near silence. The chicken was dry, the vegetables oversalted, but no one commented. The house settled and groaned around them. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, sharp, frantic, a note of terror that cut through the stillness, and Richard felt the unease of the night settle heavier in his chest. A dog barked somewhere outside, sharp and urgent, before a distant voice called it back inside. Richard checked his watch, 7:50. Diane broke the quiet. "We should all stay downstairs tonight, family night, watch a movie together." Lucas lifted his eyes. "Why?" "Because it would be nice," Diane replied, trying for cheer. He frowned. "It's Monday. We never do family nights on Monday." The logic landed with quiet precision, slicing through the thin veil of normalcy they tried to maintain. Diane set down her fork with deliberate care. "Let's just start," she suggested. Lucas pushed back, muttering about homework, then corrected himself. Stuff to do. He was already heading up the stairs, each step heavy, deliberate. When his bedroom door slammed, it echoed through the house like a full stop in a sentence. Diane stayed frozen, staring at her plate. Timmy reached across the table and touched her hand. "It's okay," he whispered. "Lucas is just being Lucas." "I know," she murmured, barely audible, her voice a fragile thread. "Want me to help clean up?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. Timmy moved with quiet efficiency, clearing plates, scraping scraps into the trash, stacking dishes, wiping counters. Every motion precise, almost reverent, as if he understood the weight of the silence around him. "I'll be in my room if you need anything," he said when he finished, planting a gentle kiss on Diane's cheek before disappearing upstairs. Richard and Diane were left alone, listening to the house breathe. The dishwasher hummed. The refrigerator clicked, settling into its usual rhythm. From above came the bass thump of Lucas's music. A headache made audible, pressing down on the walls. Diane's voice cut through the hum. "Tell me the truth. Do you think something is wrong with him?" Richard blinked, unsure what she meant, but she wouldn't let him sidestep. Her voice shook, raw and honest. "I'm afraid of him. I see it in his face. He's stripped of everything but fear. What he is, what he might become." Richard had no answer. They had never spoken it aloud, never named the dread that had grown silently, festering in the corners of their home. Saying it made it real, undeniable, a weight they could no longer ignore. He tried the familiar comforts, troubled, misunderstood, adjusting, but Diane pressed on. Adjusting to what? They had given him everything: therapy, guidance, countless chances. How many chances could one child take before the odds ran out? As many as it takes, Richard said, though the words sounded empty even to his own ears. And if it never takes, Diane asked, her voice sharp and trembling, if this is just who he is? Lucas. The word hung between them like smoke, filling the kitchen with something heavier than the night outside. Richard thought of that blank, unreadable face across the dinner table, the perfect mask hiding whatever thoughts churned behind it. He remembered the Brenner boys' broken arm, the fire in the chemistry lab, the escalating trail of small disasters no one could predict or prevent. And then he thought of Timmy, graceful, patient, endlessly kind, navigating a home shadowed by his brother's chaos. Timmy was a miracle, a gift neither of them had earned. We should get some sleep, Richard said quietly, though the words sounded hollow. But neither moved. They lingered in the kitchen, listening to the house settle, its creaks and whispers like a living thing, waiting for something unnamed. At 9:30, Richard finally rose and made his way upstairs. Lucas's door was shut, bass-heavy music thumping behind it. Richard knocked, no answer. He tried the knob, it was locked. Lucas opened the door. A pause, then a flat, almost bored voice. I'm going to sleep. It's 9:30, I'm tired. Richard rested his hand against the door and felt the familiar weight of helplessness. He could demand entry, force the door open. But why? Lucas would only meet him with those blank, cold eyes, reflecting back his own weakness. He turned and walked down the hall to Timmy's room. The door was ajar, soft light spilling into the corridor. Richard knocked gently and pushed it open. Timmy sat at his desk, absorbed in a textbook, his lamp painting a circle of warm light. The room was immaculate, bed made with crisp hospital corners, books perfectly aligned, not a scrap of paper out of place. Certificates lined the walls, a quiet testament to diligence and care. I'm just checking in, Richard said softly. Timmy looked up and smiled. I'm fine, just finishing some reading for English. Richard glanced at the clock. It's getting late. I know, I'll stop soon, Timmy said, closing the book and swiveling in his chair. Then his gaze sharpened. Is Mom okay? She seemed upset at dinner. Richard felt a lump in his throat. The concern was so genuine, so tender. She's fine, just stressed about the party tomorrow. I could help set up in the morning before school, Timmy offered. That would be great. She'd really appreciate that. Timmy nodded, then hesitated, searching Richard's face. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Lucas will ever? Do you think he'll ever get better? The question struck Richard like a sudden chill. Timmy rarely spoke of his brother so plainly, as if nomming him aloud might break some invisible law of loyalty. Richard chose his words slowly. I hope so, he said, then asked gently why Timmy was wondering. The boy's gaze dropped to his hands. Sometimes I worry. Maybe me being me makes it worse, he whispered. Maybe it makes him feel worse about himself. Richard crossed the room and rested a hand on Timmy's shoulder. No, he said firmly, voice low but steady. Never, none of this is your fault. You've done nothing wrong. Timmy's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of unspoken burdens pressing on him. I just wish things were different, he murmured. Richard squeezed his shoulder, swallowing the lump in his throat. We all do, he said. In the warm circle of lamplight, father and son lingered, suspended between heartache and hope. Richard felt a fierce surge of protectiveness so intense it throbbed like a second heartbeat. Whatever else had gone wrong in their lives, they had this. They had Timmy. Go get some sleep soon, he said gently. Big day tomorrow. I will, Timmy replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Good night, Dad. Richard returned the sentiment, closed the door, and lingered in the hallway for a moment. Silence had fallen over the house. Lucas's music had stopped, leaving the rooms heavy with expectation, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears like the calm before a storm. He could hear Diane in their bedroom, moving carefully, the soft click of her lamp, the faint creak of the bed as she settled. The thermostat read 72, but the air felt thicker somehow, colder in the bones. Richard went downstairs, checking locks, testing windows, peering out into the dark backyard where shadows stretched unnaturally. Nothing moved. The clock in the hall glowed 10:47. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, slipping under the covers beside Diane. She was rigid, tense, eyes closed but not asleep. Did you lock everything? She whispered. Yes, he said, even the back gate. Her breathing paused, then continued in shallow, uneven pulls. I keep thinking about that book, she murmured. About Krampus, how he knew which children deserved punishment. Richard opened his mouth to redirect her, but she spoke over him, voice trembling in the dark. What if he was real? What if something really did come for the bad children? Something that saw what they could? Richard's reply came sharper than he intended. If that were true, he said, voice hard, Lucas would have been gone years ago. Diane made a sound fragile, wavering somewhere between surrender and despair. Richard reached for her hand, found it cold, and held it in the quiet darkness. They lay together, wide awake, the house around them murmuring and settling, shadows thickening at the edges, waiting for something neither of them could name. Richard lay in the dark, listening to the house breathe around them. The digital clock projected green numbers across the ceiling. 11:23, 11:37, 11:52. Then, exactly at midnight, it came, the sound of something heavy landing on the roof. Slow, deliberate, impossible to mistake. Richard bolted upright, heart hammering. Diane was already sitting beside him, hand pressed to her mouth, wide-eyed. He tried to whisper it off a branch, the wind, but the night outside was dead still. No wind, no stir of leaves. The footsteps moved again, steady, purposeful. Not the frantic scuttle of an animal, but the measured tread of something walking upright, something aware, something hunting. Diane clutched his arm, digging her fingers in like a lifeline, whispering his name like a prayer. He told her to stay, pulled on his robe, and crept to the window. The backyard lay in icy silence, illuminated harshly by the security light. Nothing. Frosted grass, empty shadows. Yet above, the sound continued, moving closer to the front of the house, toward the chimney. Diane scrambled out of bed, robe wrapped around her shaking body. We have to check on the boys, she said, voice tight. They crept into the hallway together. Lucas's door was shut, dark. Timmy's room equally dark. Everything looked normal, but the roof told another story. Footsteps and now a dragging sound. Chains. Richard tried to anchor himself in reason. The TV antenna, branches scraping, ice cracking in the gutters. Every logical explanation lined up in his mind, but terror had already flooded his veins. At the top of the stairs, Diane froze. Listen, she whispered. From below came a new sound, the metallic scrape of the fireplace damper opening. They hadn't lit a fire. The flue had been sealed. Richard moved down the stairs first, Diane close behind, their movements slow and heavy as if through water. The living room was dark, familiar. The Christmas tree waited quietly in the corner, ornaments reflecting faint moonlight. But the fireplace, something shifted there. He reached for the light switch. Diane hissed for him not to. He flipped it anyway. The room erupted in light. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed wrong. The furniture, the ornaments, the carefully arranged living space, all normal. And then, a leg emerged from the chimney. Thick, matted fur covered it, ending in a cloven hoof that struck the hearth with a chilling clang, ringing through the room like a tolling bell. Richard's stomach plummeted, his pulse surging. The sound of deliberate, unnatural motion continued above, the dragging of chains scraping across the roof as the nightmare he had only feared in whispers now took solid form before him. Richard's mind refused to accept it. The edges of his vision blurred, reality warping around the impossible. Another leg appeared from the chimney, then a torso, unfolding like a grotesque marionette, bending at angles that should not exist. It grew taller, more monstrous, until it towered over them. 7 feet of fur, leather, and muscle, a distorted echo of a human form. Its face was a nightmare stitched together from goat, demon, and something older, something beyond language. Horns spiraled from its skull, and in one hand it held chains that scraped across the floor like a funeral procession. Diane let out a sound, not a scream, more the release of lungs crushed by some immense weight. Richard couldn't move, couldn't speak. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his body was frozen. The creature turned its head with the slow, deliberate swing of a centuries-old door. Its eyes were worse than anything else. Neither human nor animal, yet containing the knowledge of both and more. They pierced into Richard, seeing truths he had never admitted even to himself. From upstairs came a new noise. Lucas's door creaked open. The creature's head swung toward the stairs, chains dragging with deliberate menace. Richard found a voice, barely a whisper. No. The monster paused, tilting its head. In those eyes flickered something, amusement, contempt, or both. Lucas appeared at the top of the stairs, his face drained of color, mouth opening in silent horror. He stumbled down, half falling, half scrambling, a thin, keening sound escaping him. Richard had never seen real fear in his son, never truly. The sight was worse than the creature itself. At the bottom of the stairs, Lucas pressed against the wall, eyes locked on the nightmare before him, whispering again and again, "Please, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." A dark stain spread across his pajamas, dissolving all pretense of teenage bravado into raw, animal terror. The creature took a step forward, chains rattling like death itself. Diane moved first. She placed herself between the thing and her son, arms outstretched, voice breaking but unyielding. "No!" she screamed, the sound shattering the stillness of the room, challenging the impossible that had invaded their home. Her voice trembled, cracking under the weight of raw desperation. "He's just a child," she cried. "He's made mistakes, but he can change. He will change." The creature paused, tilting that impossible, massive head, its gaze sweeping over them like a judgment. Richard felt his body move before his mind could catch up, stepping forward alongside Diane. Together they formed a fragile barrier of flesh and will between the monster and their son. Behind them, Lucas collapsed into sobs, the blank mask of his usual indifference shattered by pure terror. Diane's words tumbled out, urgent, pleading, almost incoherent. "He's troubled, he's struggled, but he's not evil. He's just a boy who's lost his way. We'll do better. We'll get him help, real help. Whatever it takes, please don't take him." The creature lingered, motionless, as if weighing the sincerity in their voices. Its chains scraped against the floor, a sound like doom itself. Then slowly, it turned and began moving across the living room. Its hooves struck the wood with a chilling percussion. Richard felt a flicker of relief. It was retreating, returning to the dark from which it had come. And then it climbed. Before the thought could fully form, Richard knew where it was going. The creature was ascending toward the second floor, toward the bedrooms, toward Timmy. Diane screamed. They both surged forward, adrenaline and terror fueling impossible speed. The monster moved like smoke, up the stairs in a fluid, inhuman motion. Richard's legs pounded 3 steps at a time, Diane close behind, Lucas forgotten in the living room, tears still streaming. The hallway was dark, but at the end, Timmy's door stood open. Light spilled from inside, warm and steady. And there he was, calm, composed, standing beside his bed, already dressed as though he had been waiting. Not a hint of fear in his posture, only quiet, measured acceptance and eyes that reflected something Richard had never seen before. Awareness, calculation, a strange, unsettling clarity. The creature filled the doorway. Timmy looked up at it, voice steady, almost eerie. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said. The familiar sweetness was gone. In its place, a cold, precise cadence, the voice of someone far older than his years. Richard lunged forward, placing himself between his son and the monster. "There's been a mistake. This is Timmy. He's good. He's the good one." The creature's massive hand shot out, closing around Timmy's arm, and Timmy didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, watching his parents with a calm curiosity that made Richard's chest tight. "Father," Timmy said softly, almost politely, "you should probably stop." Richard's voice cracked as he shouted, "Let go of my son." Diane was beside him now, pulling at the creature's arm, screaming with every ounce of her being, tears streaming freely. "You've made a mistake. This isn't him. This is the wrong child." The room trembled with the weight of the impossible, and all Richard could do was hold on to hope that the boy they had raised, their beacon in a household shadowed by fear, would somehow endure the night unscathed. Lucas was downstairs, or so they had believed. The creature's voice rolled through the room like gravel grinding underfoot, like wind tearing through dead branches, like the echo of the last sound a man hears before the water swallows him. It came from somewhere deeper than flesh and throat, vibrating in Richard's chest, rattling his bones, resonating in his skull. "I do not punish bad behavior," it said. "I punish bad souls." And then Richard saw it, not through the creature's eyes, he wasn't sure how, but through some fracture in reality in himself. He glimpsed the truth he had been too blind, too trusting, or too desperate to see. He saw Timmy at 7, slipping pills into the neighbor's dog food, his gaze detached, almost clinical, fascinated by the way the animal convulsed. At 9, he saw him forging Lucas's handwriting, sending a note to the principal with meticulous care, the act masked behind the guise of mischief. At 11, the chemistry lab fire, Timmy stepping back, letting Lucas shoulder the blame, his expression a masterful mask of shocked innocence. He saw years of careful construction, the strategic kindness, the calculated charity, every act of goodness a brick in an unassailable fortress of virtue, every smile, every helpful gesture, a tool wielded with surgical precision. The manipulation wasn't sloppy or desperate. It was brilliant, subtle, years in the making. Timmy had ensured he was indispensable while Lucas became expendable. And then he saw what had been quietly taking shape beneath it all. The life insurance policy Richard had left carelessly open on his desk. The endless questions about the house, about inheritance, about what would happen if their parents weren't there. The casual curiosity about tragedies, accidental deaths, the quiet fascination with true crime. At 12, he didn't need full comprehension. He only needed a skeleton of knowledge, a crude understanding enough to engineer the perfect scenario. He had positioned himself as the grieving angel, the golden child, the one no one would suspect. The helpful boy who had always been good was a mask. Behind it lay calculation, cunning, a mind crafting a future where he inherited everything and suspicion never touched him. Every act of goodness, every careful smile, every perfect grade, designed, honed, and lethal in its simplicity. Richard's stomach turned. The Timmy he had adored, the son who radiated warmth and light, had never truly existed. Not fully. What had always been there was this: brilliance twisted into cold precision, hidden behind the most convincing mask of innocence imaginable. The chains coiled around Timmy's wrists, biting into his skin with cold, unyielding force. He looked down at them, then slowly raised his gaze to his parents and smiled. Not the Timmy they had known, warm and tender, bright-eyed and earnest. This was something else, something older, sharper, calculated. "I almost had it perfect," he said, voice calm, eerily composed. "Another year, maybe two. The trust fund would have been ours. Luca's, he'd be out of the way by then. Probably locked up somewhere, thanks to the way I set things up." He shrugged, casual, as if shrugging off the weight of a world-altering confession. Accidents happen. Diane let out a sound that was barely human, something between a sob and a scream of despair. Richard's knees buckled. He slid down the wall, sinking to the floor, eyes fixed on the creature wearing his son's face. Timmy's lips curled in the faintest smile, the kind that twisted the familiar into something unrecognizable. "I'm relieved, actually," Timmy continued, as if they were sharing a quiet evening together, discussing homework or dinner plans. "It's exhausting being good all the time. Ever wonder how boring it is to pretend to care? Listening to mom's worries, smiling at teachers who barely understand half of what you do, it wears you down." The chains rattled as the creature tugged him toward the door. Timmy stepped lightly, gliding over Richard's legs with an unsettling ease. "I suppose I should thank Lucas," he said. "He made it so easy. Everyone focused on what a disaster he is. No one ever noticed what I was doing. The perfect scapegoat." Diane's voice trembled behind Richard, a fragile whisper. "Please, he's sick. He needs help." Timmy's eyes flicked toward her, and the pity in them was a knife. "I'm not sick," he said softly. This is just who I am. Some people are born like this. I just happen to be better at it than Lucas ever was." They moved down the hallway, chains clinking, Timmy walking beside the monstrous figure as if in quiet agreement. At the bottom of the stairs, Lucas lingered, half hidden, frozen in terror. Timmy paused, looking at his older brother. "Sorry about all that," he said casually. "Nothing personal, you were just useful." Lucas said nothing. He could only stare, comprehension dawning like ice spreading across his heart. The creature and its captive advanced toward the fireplace. Timmy turned once, giving his parents a small, eerie wave. Richard and Diane, collapsed against the wall, could only watch. "Merry Christmas," he said, voice calm, unsettlingly cheerful. And then it happened. The creature folded itself back into the chimney, dragging Timmy with it. He didn't struggle. He didn't scream. He went quietly, almost eagerly, as if being seen for what he truly was had offered some grim satisfaction. The last thing Richard saw was his son's face, peering down from the darkness of the chimney, illuminated by a faint, infernal glow. Timmy's smile cut through the shadows, sharp and triumphant. The sound of rushing wind filled the room, and in that moment the truth settled over the house like ice. The boy they had raised as innocence itself had been hiding a darkness far older, far colder than anyone could have imagined. The wind outside had died, leaving a stillness so thick it felt almost tangible, pressing into every corner of the house. The silence hung like a weight, heavier than any sound that had come before, settling over the walls, the floorboards, even the spaces where breath should have been. Richard finally tore his gaze from the empty fireplace. His eyes found Diane's, staring hollow, grief-etched so deep it seemed impossible to measure. No tears came. The sorrow was too vast for them. They looked at each other across the ruin of everything they had believed, everything they had built, and in that reflection saw their own devastation staring back. Slowly, almost reluctantly, their attention shifted to the foot of the stairs. Lucas stood there, no longer the brooding, indifferent teenager who had sulked through dinner. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by fear, stripped bare of defiance. His face was pale, streaked with tears, trembling with a terror that went beyond words. There was something else there too, a dawning awareness that the nightmare he had always lived in had never been the one he expected. For the first time in years, all three of them occupied the same space, bearing witness to a truth too vast and terrible to name. No one spoke. No language could hold what had just occurred. Outside, December pressed on as it always did, indifferent and cold. Inside the Caldwell home, three figures stood among the wreckage of their family, bound together by shock and loss. The silence they shared was not comfort. It was the quiet of survivors who had discovered too late that a war had been raging all along, and that they had been fighting the wrong enemy. And yet the living room betrayed none of the chaos. The Christmas tree waited patiently in its corner, untouched, a promise of a celebration that would never come. The furniture remained arranged just so, pristine and unyielding. Everything was exactly in place. Everything, that is, except the boy who should have been upstairs in his immaculate room, smiling that perfect, unassailable smile, the boy who had always been good. Story 2, they told us the house was a steal. That should have been the first warning. The rent was laughably low for a place like that. Arched windows, pale stone walls, iron balconies that caught the sun just right. A mansion, or close enough to one that 4 broke college students felt like we'd won the lottery just by stepping inside. We were 20, reckless, convinced the world owed us a little magic. Harold Pincher showed us around that afternoon. He was old in a way that felt permanent, like time had stopped trying to fix him. His hands trembled when he spoke, fingers freckled and thin, and his breath smelled sharply of mint candy. He smiled too often, like smiling was a habit he used to hide something else. "This way," he said, leading us toward the basement. The air changed the moment we started down the stairs. Cooler, damp. The smell of stone and moisture clung to the walls, old and stubborn. Florida foundations always had that scent, but this felt heavier somehow, like the house was breathing underground. That's when he showed us the room. He pressed a book on a built-in shelf, 3rd volume from the left, and the entire case swung open. Behind it waited a thick steel door, matte gray, cold even to look at. "A panic room," Pincher said almost proudly. He showed us the lock, his shaking hands lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't a key. It wasn't a code. Just a smooth scanner, updated from whatever had been there before. He mentioned trouble a few years back and didn't elaborate. Inside, the room was windowless and tight. Concrete walls thick enough to swallow sound. Metal shelves stocked with water, canned food, medical kits. A generator sat in the corner like a patient animal. 2 narrow cots folded against the wall. A chemical toilet hid behind a flimsy screen, which somehow made it worse. not better. Previous tenant liked to be prepared, Pincher said, running his palm along the door like he was remembering something. Did they ever need it? K.H. Lowe asked. She always noticed things the rest of us skipped over. Pincher hesitated, just a beat too long. Once, he said, and closed the door. We signed the lease that same day. The night everything went wrong was October 31st. I know the date because my phone told me later. At the time, all I knew was that something shattered downstairs at exactly the wrong kind of hour. It wasn't an accident. Glass doesn't sound like that when it falls on its own. This was forceful, intentional. I froze at my desk, laptop still glowing, my essay unfinished and suddenly meaningless. I told myself it was nothing. College neighborhoods were loud, chaotic, full of bad decisions made after midnight. Then I heard voices. Low, calm, focused. Not drunk, not lost. I opened my bedroom door inch by inch. The hallway was dark except for the small nightlight K.H. Lowe insisted on keeping plugged in. From below came footsteps, heavy ones moving across tile. Something metallic scraped along the floor, slow and deliberate. That was when I knew. I whispered for the others. Doors cracked open, faces pale in the dim light. No one screamed. Fear doesn't always do that. Sometimes it just makes you very, very quiet. We moved together, barefoot, hearts hammering. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, past the ruined window where glass glittered like ice on the floor. The basement door stood open. We didn't argue, we didn't hesitate. We went straight for the bookshelf. K.H. Lowe's hand shook as she pressed the book. The shelf swung wide. The steel door waited. And then the knocking started. At first it was distant, someone calling out, voices overlapping. Hello. We know you're in there. Open the door. The lock sealed with a dull, final sound. The room filled with the soft hum of ventilation and the sound of our own breathing. 4 people pressed into a space never meant to be comforting. The voices grew closer. Polite at first, reasonable. We just want to talk. There's no need for this. Then the tone shifted. Harder, sharper. They found the bookshelf. We heard it move. Someone laughed quietly like they just solved a puzzle. The knocking came again, this time on steel. Open the door. The sound traveled through the walls, through our bones. The door didn't bend. It didn't answer. The voices changed again. Angry now, insistent. They told us the police were coming. They told us the house was on fire. They told us they could help. They lied beautifully. Hours passed, or minutes. Time stopped behaving normally in that room. The generator kicked on. The air felt thinner. Someone cried, someone prayed. The knocking never stopped. Eventually it slowed, then it ended. Silence settled in, thick and waiting. We stayed inside until morning, until our phones buzzed with missed calls and sirens wailed outside, until someone opened the door from the other side and light poured back into the world. The police said the intruders were gone. No signs of forced entry beyond the broken window. No suspects. No explanation. We moved out a week later. Years have passed since then, but sometimes, late at night, I still think about that room, about how prepared it was, about the old landlord shaking hands, about the way his smile slipped when K.H. Lowe asked the wrong question. And I wonder how many times people sat in that space before us, listening to the same voices, being told the same thing, to open the door. The sound carried upward with horrifying precision. Each footstep echoed through the stairwell, slow and measured, as if whoever was climbing wanted them to hear every inch of progress. Mike stepped out into the hallway then, tall, broad-shouldered, usually the kind of presence that made people think twice, but half awake, barefoot, wearing nothing but sleep and a faded campus shirt. He looked as exposed as the rest of us. No one spoke. Words felt dangerous now, like they might give us away. I pointed toward the stairs. Mike followed my gaze and nodded once. At the far end of the hall, K.H. Lowe was already sitting upright on her bed, phone clenched in her hand. The screen washed her face in pale blue light, her eyes wide, alert. When she saw us, she didn't ask questions. She only shaped one silent word with her lips. Downstairs. Before I could whisper anything, some half-formed plan, some lie that might calm us, the steps changed direction. They were coming up, not rushing, not sneaking, just climbing one stair at a time, unhurried and confident. That was the worst part. Whoever it was didn't sound worried about being stopped. Jessica appeared in the doorway behind us. She'd gone down for water and hadn't made it back in time. Her phone was still in her hand, unlocked. I caught a glimpse of the screen, a string of messages from her mom unanswered. Ordinary concern frozen in time. Are you eating enough? Are you coming home soon? Call me when you can, sweetheart. Love you. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, as if she might still answer. Then a beam of light sliced through the darkness. A flashlight swept the hallway wall, slow and searching, and something inside me snapped into motion. I grabbed Jessica's wrist and pulled her into K.H. Lowe's room. Mike followed without hesitation. We pressed ourselves against the wall beside the closet, holding our breath, hearts pounding loud enough that I was sure it could be heard. For a few fragile seconds, we clung to the impossible hope that we might be overlooked, that this was just a scare, that if we stayed still enough, quiet enough, it would pass. The light found the doorway. It slid across K.H. Lowe's bed, her desk, the clutter of textbooks and loose papers, the poster she'd hung the day she moved in, a girl staring back with unreadable eyes. The beam lingered, careful and thorough, not rushed, not angry, searching. Mike leaned close, barely breathing, and whispered a single word that felt like our last chance. Basement. They didn't hesitate. Whatever unspoken signal passed between them landed all at once, and they moved together, bodies low, breath shallow. Mike took point, easing into the hallway just as the flashlight glow slid into the next bedroom. Ben's room. They heard drawers ripped open, the careless crash of belongings hitting the floor. More than one voice now. At least two upstairs. Others still below, moving with purpose. There was no time to count. The staircase loomed ahead, wide and naked, every step a potential announcement. Still, it was the only way. They descended in a tight knot, Mike first, then K.H. Lowe, Jessica close behind, Ben last, each footfall sounding thunderous in his ears. The house betrayed them with every creak and groan, but the people inside were louder. Cabinets slammed. Furniture scraped. The noise covered them barely. The kitchen waited at the back of the house, dim and empty when they reached it. Luck carried them that far, the thin, sickening kind that felt temporary. The basement door stood where it always had, plain and unremarkable, as if it hadn't been the landlord's strangest selling point. They slipped through and closed it softly behind them. The stairwell dropped into pure dark. Mike reached for the light switch, then stopped. No light. Light was an invitation. They went down blind, palms sliding along cold walls, feet probing for the next step. At the bottom, Ben's memory surged forward, hands trembling, heart racing, as he turned toward the bookshelf. He found the spines by touch alone, counting without counting, panic smearing the numbers in his head. Third volume, he pressed. A muted click answered him. The shelf shifted aside with a quiet sigh, revealing the steel door hidden behind it. Mike planted his thumb on the scanner. Seconds stretched thin and fragile until the lock released with a deep, final sound that felt like a promise. They rushed inside. Ben was last. As his hand closed around the interior handle, something changed above them. The searching noises sharpened. Footsteps pounded across the kitchen ceiling, fast now, urgent. Someone had realized. Ben hauled the door shut, just as the sound reached the basement stairs. The lock sealed itself. The shelf slid back into place, unseen but felt, and suddenly they were enclosed, concrete thick enough to stop the world, steel heavy enough to defy it. The room felt smaller than it had before, the air tighter, every breath sounded too loud. Then came the quiet. It lasted long enough for terror to settle into their bones, long enough for each of them to wonder if this was safety or simply a pause before something worse. 90 seconds passed with no sound at all. And in that silence, every one of them understood the same thing. Whatever was happening upstairs hadn't ended. The noise returned, but not where they expected it, not against the steel door that they knew would have echoed even through concrete. This came from above them, from the basement ceiling itself. Deep, deliberate impacts, not frantic, not angry, careful, measured. Someone was striking the walls in a pattern, listening for the lie in the structure, for the hollow truth hidden behind stone. Each blow traveled through the floor and up their legs, a dull vibration that made Ben's teeth buzz. He started counting without meaning to. 11, 14, 19, whoever it was didn't rush. They were mapping the space. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. In that pause, voices emerged, blurred by layers of steel and wood, stripped of words but rich with intention. Human voices, at least two. One asking questions in a rising cadence, another answering briefly, decisively. A conversation, a plan being shaped right above their heads. Mike finally reached the wall and flipped the switch. The lights came on with a harsh flicker, revealing the room in full. Bare, functional, unforgiving. In that instant, Ben realized how completely they'd changed. Minutes ago, they were students worried about grades and deadlines. Now they looked like people who had crossed into something irreversible. Mike's arm was torn open. The cut ran long and deep, skin split wide enough to show pale tissue beneath before blood welled up and spilled over. He stared at it with distant curiosity, as if noticing damage on borrowed property. K.H. Lowe didn't hesitate. She guided him down onto one of the cots and moved to the shelves, her hands steady as she pulled antiseptic and gauze, working with quiet precision. Blood dripped onto the carpet. Dark spots bloomed and spread, joining stains whose stories none of them wanted to imagine. Jessica stood apart, foam glowing in her hands. She turned slowly, searching for a signal that refused to exist. Nothing. No bars, no hope of connection. The walls around them swallowed everything. Sound, light, escape. A perfect cage. They searched the room anyway. Lockers opened. Shelves shifted. Inventory became a ritual of control. Water jugs, canned food, blankets folded too neatly, batteries, flashlights, a generator humming with false reassurance. Supplies meant for endurance, not rescue. Above them, footsteps moved again. Slow, certain. And in the sterile glow of that room, with the air humming and blood soaking into the floor, they all understood the same truth at once. This wasn't a burglary. It was a hunt. At the very bottom of one locker sat a hard plastic case. Inside it, a revolver, useless without the key that was nowhere to be found. No radios, no phones that worked, no signal, no voice, no way to reach anyone beyond the concrete shell wrapped around them. The room wasn't a refuge anymore. It was an island cut clean from the world. Ben forced his thoughts into straight lines. The landlord had said 3 days worth of supplies. 72 hours. That was the math. Whoever was upstairs would eventually take what they wanted and leave. That was the purpose of a room like this. Endure, then emerge, then call for help. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of plan people survived on. And yet, even as he clung to it, something felt deeply off. A wrongness he couldn't name. K.H. finished wrapping Mike's arm, white gauze already blooming with red. She tied it tight and leaned back. No one said the question, but it lived between them, breathing in the silence. What if the people upstairs didn't leave? What if they already knew? The answer came in the form of sound. The impact started again, harder now, closer. No longer exploratory, no longer curious. Each strike landed in the same place, spaced evenly like someone measuring time instead of distance. The walls shuddered. Dust drifted from the ceiling. This wasn't a search anymore. It was confirmation. Then the voices came through the vent. Not shouting, not threats, something far worse. Jessica froze first. Her phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. From the thin metal grill above them came her mother's voice, strained, distorted, but unmistakably hers. "Call me when you can, sweetie." The exact words, the same cadence, then static swallowed it whole. Ben staggered back as his own voice followed, warped and dragging, repeating a sentence he'd written earlier that night. His words, stripped of context and mercy, stretched into something that sounded like an accusation. K.H. heard her father, calm, encouraging, a phrase he'd said countless times while teaching her to work with her hands. Now it drifted through the air like a ghost that knew her name. Mike heard all of them. Fragments of conversations from hours ago, questions about locks, jokes about safety, assurances spoken casually, confidently, foolishly. Their own voices, rearranged and returned to them like evidence. He tried to explain it away. Bad air, stress, panic playing tricks on the brain, carbon monoxide maybe, hallucinations made shared by fear. But the lie collapsed immediately. They weren't hearing the same thing. Each voice was precise, personal, designed. The banging intensified, striking directly in front of them now, every blow delivered with patient certainty. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They were letting them know. They had time. They had information. And they were not going anywhere. It listened to whoever was nearest, pulling straight from memory, reshaping the familiar into something warped and hostile. That was the cruelty of it. Threats could be ignored. Threats came from outsiders. This came from inside them. Their own histories sharpened and turned back on their throats. Time stopped behaving like time. The panic room had no windows, no sunrise or sunset to anchor reality. Ben's phone glowed with numbers that felt meaningless. 4:23 a.m., then 6:47, then 9:50. Each glance felt disconnected from the last, as if the device were lying or time itself had fractured. They could have been sealed down there for minutes. They could have been entombed for weeks. The fluorescent lights never changed, a false noon that pressed down on them without mercy. The voices returned at irregular intervals, sometimes loud, sometimes barely there. sometimes so distorted they couldn't tell if it was speech or just the house breathing. But the pattern never changed. Each voice knew exactly who it was meant for. Each message was chosen with care. Mike was the first to slip. The bleeding had stopped, but his arm looked wrong. Skin flushed, swollen, radiating heat. He swallowed ibuprofen without comment, but it did nothing. He sat slumped on one of the cots, eyes locked on the ventilation grate above them, head tilting now, and then like he was tracking a signal only he could hear. At some point, no one could say when, the banging shifted. It wasn't random anymore. 3 strikes. Pause. 2 strikes. Pause. 3 strikes again. Over and over, patient, intentional. Mike lifted his head. His eyes were too bright, fever-glass bright, reflecting the harsh light overhead. He spoke softly, almost thoughtfully. "They're not trying to get in," he said. "They're trying to get us out." Jessica frowned. Ben felt the same confusion twist in his chest. Mike laughed, a brittle sound that cut the air. "Think about it," he said. They'd been down there for hours, nothing upstairs being dragged away. No cabinets empty, no rush, just the wall, just the vents, just them. "What kind of robbers do that?" he asked. The question landed harder than it should have. Ben hated that it made sense. Home invasions were supposed to be fast. Smash, grab, vanish. These people hadn't left. They hadn't even tried to breach the room directly. Everything they were doing pointed inward, toward the panic room, toward the 4 of them. Jessica said it was the blood loss, infection, fever messing with Mike's head. Mike turned slowly to look at her. Sweat ran down his temples. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Have any of you actually seen them?" he asked. Silence. They'd heard glass break, heard footsteps, heard voices, but faces, bodies, proof. No one answered. Ben mentioned the flashlight he'd glimpsed upstairs, a moving beam, a shape behind it. Mike nodded like that proved his point. "A light," he said. "That's all any of us saw, a shadow, a sound." The knocking continued, steady, calm. Like someone on the other side, waiting for the door to open from within. Mike's head tilted slightly as if a single thought had just crystallized. A flashlight, not a person, just a beam of light, could be anyone. Could be emergency responders, firefighters, police, arriving for some late-night accident. K.H. Lowe frowned, voice tight. "Why would the fire department break into our house at 3 in the morning?" Mike opened his mouth, hesitated, and then went quiet. His eyes glazed over, distant, as though the answer had slipped through his fingers before he could catch it. He admitted he didn't know, but deep down he could feel the wrongness pressing in. Not outside, not the night, but here, inside. Their words died in the stillness. Silence settled like a dense fog, each of them grappling with the weight of unspoken terror, trying to separate hallucination from some hidden truth. Ben's mind drifted to the house itself, to Pincher's demonstration of the panic room. The way the old landlord had hesitated when K.H. Lowe asked if the judge had ever used it. What had happened that one time? Why the sudden change of subject? The question lingered, unanswered, like smoke curling through the corners of his thoughts. Then came the generator, or more accurately, its failure. Day 2, or whatever day Ben's phone insisted it was, the fluorescent lights flickered, sputtered, and died, swallowing the room in total darkness. For what felt like an eternity, they listened only to their own breaths, small, fragile human sounds in the abyss. Then Jessica, trembling, found the courage to switch on her phone's flashlight. The lead beam cut through the void, casting pale, spectral shadows across their faces, twisting features into grotesque, unfamiliar masks. Chloe moved first, careful. precise, moving like someone performing a delicate surgery in the dim light. She knelt beside the generator, the phone's beam glinting off metal surfaces, fingers tracing the machinery with the skill of someone who had spent weekends rebuilding engines long before college. After several minutes, she leaned back, frustration and realization flickering across her face. The generator itself was fine. The blockage was elsewhere in the fuel line. It could be cleared, she said, eventually. But there were no guarantees, no promises. Ben turned toward the vents, asking about airflow. K.H. Lowe's silence answered for her. Slowly, the truth settled over them like dust. The air had grown heavy, each inhalation more labored than the last. The constant hum of the ventilation system, something they had long ignored, was gone. The absence was immediate, tangible. The stale, suffocating air pressed in, the subtle rise of carbon dioxide already beginning to dull minds, make thoughts sluggish. Chloe's voice broke the realization into words, careful, factual, but threaded with urgency. "We've got some time," she said. "It's not airtight. Air will seep in through the door, through the ducts. We'll be fine for now. But eventually, if it stays off, headaches, confusion, fatigue, it will get worse." And in that darkness, the four of them understood. Survival was no longer just about hiding. It was about counting breaths, measuring time in ragged inhalations, navigating uncertainty without a map, while the walls themselves seemed to close in, listening, waiting, judging. Blackouts. That was the end point K.H. Lowe hadn't said out loud. Loss of awareness. How fast it would happen depended on how much fresh air was slipping in through cracks and seals that were never meant to keep people alive, only safe. Ben's thoughts spiraled. 18 inches of concrete, a steel door built to resist anything from the outside, a sanctuary engineered so perfectly it had become a trap. Mike laughed from the cot. The sound floated oddly in the dark, detached from his body, like it belonged to someone else entirely. "That's what they've been saying," he murmured. "Out there, they're not trying to break in, they're trying to get us out." Jessica snapped back that the intruders were the ones who killed the power, sabotaged it. Mike's voice returned, calm, almost gentle. Or maybe the system had been dying for years. Maybe it had always been unreliable. Maybe tonight was just when it finally failed, and they were unlucky enough to be inside when it did. The landlord had said the judge used the room once. What if he never came out? The thought settled heavily between them. Why the house stood empty. Why the rent had been impossibly cheap. Why Pincher's eyes had slid away from K.H. Lowe's question so quickly. Ben thought of the carpet beneath their feet, darkened with stains that didn't look like spills. Of the chemical toilet meant for long stays. Of a man who might have waited down here, counting breaths, listening to sounds above him that never turned into rescue. Then the impact started again. Not frantic, not violent, measured, 3 hits. Pause, 2 hits, pause, 3 again, over and over. Not an attempt to break through, something closer to a signal, a pulse, a clock ticking down. Jessica finally spoke, forcing the words through tightening lungs. They had to choose. Stay and gamble that the air held out long enough. Or leave now while their legs still worked and their heads were clear enough to fight, or run. K.H. Lowe pointed out what they didn't know. How many people were out there, whether they had weapons. Mike cut in softly, or whether anyone was out there at all, whether the sounds were real, whether this was help, or the last test before everything went dark, or whether they had already crossed some invisible line and this was simply what came after. Jessica called it delirium, but her voice wavered. Mike didn't argue, he just said maybe, and that was worse. Breathing had become work now. Not panic yet, but effort, a conscious act. Ben noticed it suddenly, sharply. The way each inhale demanded attention, or had it always been this way? Was the air thinning, or were their minds just turning inward, magnifying every sensation? The impacts grew louder, faster, the pattern tightening like a heart racing toward failure. Whatever was waiting on the other side of that door, danger or deliverance, they were running out of time to decide. The pounding exploded into something frantic, no longer measured, no longer patient. Fists or tools slammed the wall with raw force, blows stacking so fast they became a single, endless crash. And beneath it, threaded through the violence, a sound that made Ben's stomach drop. A voice, strained, urgent, close. "Open the door." Ben checked his phone with shaking hands. 12% battery. The clock glared back at him. 7:34 p.m. November 1st. He did the math twice, hoping he was wrong. They had been sealed inside for almost 41 hours. Jessica said they should wait one more day. That had always been the agreement. Ride out the full 3 days, then leave together. K.H. Lowe shook her head. The plan hadn't included poisoned air, or a broken vent, or Mike slumped on the cot, fever-glazed eyes, chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls. Whatever was happening to him was accelerating. They would decide by vote. Stay or open the door now. Ben voted to stay. So did K.H. Lowe. Jessica chose to leave. Mike followed her without hesitation. A tie, even down here, order collapsed. Jessica swallowed and suggested chance. Draw lots. One person opens the door just enough to look. If it's safe, they all go. If it's not, the door closes and they wait. No arguments, no blame, just probability. Ben understood what it really was. A way to hand responsibility to fate so no one had to carry it alone. Jessica tore thin strips from a notebook in the medical kit, folded them tight, and hid them in her fist. One by one they drew. K.H. Lowe, Mike, Ben. Jessica took the last. They opened their hands under the weak cone of her phone's light. 3 blank slips. One marked with a tiny pencil star. Jessica. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I'll do it," she said. "Just a crack, just to see." They clustered behind her. K.H. Lowe coaxed the generator once more, coaxing a dying machine into coughing life. The lights flickered on, harsh and unforgiving. They wanted clarity for this moment. No shadows, no uncertainty. Jessica pressed her palm to the scanner. The lock released with a heavy, final sound. She wrapped her fingers around the handle, looked back at them, really looked, and then pulled. The door opened 6 inches, and the noise vanished. Not faded, not retreated. It was as if sound itself had been erased. No voices, no movement, no breath of air rushing in. Just a vast, unnatural stillness pouring through the gap, thick and wrong like the inside of a sealed tomb. Jessica pulled the door wider. The hidden shelf slid aside. The basement revealed itself. Empty. Webs draped the corners in thick gray veils, undisturbed, layered with dust that hadn't known footsteps in years. No shattered glass, no tools, no signs of struggle, no people. Just an old basement that looked as if no one had entered it for a very long time. The hammering stopped. The voices never came back. And in that silence, far worse than noise, they understood something had been pounding to get out. Not in. Jessica's footsteps sank into layers of dust so thick they could have been ash, a gray carpet that had lain untouched for decades. Not a casual web in a corner, not the kind left by a week of neglect, but heavy curtains hanging from the ceiling, draping the walls, draping the stairs, collapsing in layers so dense they swallowed light. Every surface bore the same silent weight: pipes, concrete floor, the water heater in the corner, coated in a dust that seemed to have settled over years, decades, untouched by air or life. Chloe's whisper trembled through the silence. This isn't possible. But it was there, undeniable, a basement abandoned long before any of them were born. Jessica stepped further in, her foot disturbing the gray layer for the first time in what might have been 20 years. She left a single trail of footprints, a mark of life where none had walked in decades. The others followed, moving like ghosts, or perhaps like trespassers in a nightmare with no name. The stairs groaned beneath Jessica's weight, every creak sounding impossibly loud, echoing as if the house itself had forgotten the existence of sound. She reached the top and pushed into the kitchen. The devastation was total, not ransacked, not chaotic, but deliberate, slow, patient. The refrigerator gaped open, its once frozen contents a rotted sludge. Cabinet doors dangled on broken hinges. Stains of water and time streaked the ceiling, plaster sagging, split in long, dead lines. The Italian tile beneath their feet was cracked, some pieces missing entirely, as though something immense had pressed down again and again over countless years. They moved in silence, each room repeating the same story. Patient decay, the slow triumph of neglect, entropy left unchecked. Furniture remained but carried scars, water stains, fire marks, the faint echo of violence etched into every surface. Grime on the windows muted sunlight, casting a pall of gray over everything, as if the house had been holding its breath for decades. Near the front door, Jessica spotted the newspaper, yellow, brittle, but still intact. Her fingers hovered over it, hesitant before brushing it free of dust. The date caught her eye, November 1st, 2005, 20 years ago. The headline was small, almost hidden, not the dramatic front-page news you'd expect, but the words below told the story with chilling precision. Students die in rental house tragedy. 4 Florida GF Coast University students, the article explained, had been discovered dead in the basement of this very house. The cause: carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning generator in a hidden panic room. Authorities, alerted only when the students failed to appear at Halloween parties, had broken in too late. The names, the faces, the years, they were gone, swallowed by the silence of the house, by the dust, by the weight of a secret that had been waiting for decades to meet them. And now, Jessica and the others stood in the echo of that past, realizing the horror they just escaped had already played out once, 20 years ago, in the exact same walls, with the same hidden room, the same deadly trap, and no one left alive to warn anyone ever again. They had sealed themselves inside the hidden room, maybe as a joke that spiraled out of control, maybe because they truly believed strangers were tearing through the house. No one ever figured out which. The report said the details were uncertain, the investigation unfinished. 4 names were printed beneath the story. Ben Crow, age 20. Jessica Bell, 21. Michael Edwards, 20. Chloe Reed, 19. Their names. They stood in the ruined entryway, or believed they did, and tried to absorb a truth that refused to fit inside the human mind. The crumbling walls were real. The rot in the air was real. 2 decades of abandonment were real, and yet so were they. They felt the cold floor through their shoes, smelled mold and decay, heard breath moving in and out of living lungs. Ben finally said what none of them wanted to voice. The words sounded small, fragile, useless the moment they left his mouth. Logic had stopped mattering. This wasn't a question anymore. This was a fact. Mike lowered himself to the floor, his back sliding down the wall until he sat amid the dust. His wrapped arm rested loosely across his lap. He was smiling, not with humor, not with relief, but with a quiet, unsettling calm. They weren't breaking in, he murmured. They were trying to get them out. Chloe's shoulders shook. She cried without sound, tears carving clean paths down her dust-covered cheeks. Who? She whispered. Who was trying to help them? Mike lifted his eyes. Rescue teams, he said gently. Firefighters, emergency crews, they never stopped. Ben felt something hollow open in his chest. The pounding, the voices in the vents, the urgency in that final demand to open the door. The rhythm that haunted him now, 3 hits, pause, 2 hits, pause, not random, not violent, measured, desperate, like hands pressing on a chest again and again, refusing to give up. Jessica stood frozen, clutching the newspaper so tightly the old paper began to crumble. They died in there, she said. Halloween night. The generator failed. They locked themselves inside and never came back out. Her voice faltered. Is this a memory? Are we stuck inside something that already happened? Mike tilted his head. Or maybe it's still happening, he said softly. Maybe we never left that room. Maybe this is what the brain does when it's running out of air. It tells stories, builds exits that don't exist. Ben turned away and walked to the front door. The metal handle was rough, corroded, green with age. He wrapped his hand around it and pulled. The door resisted, then opened. Outside lay Pelican Bay Drive, quiet, overgrown. Some homes lived in, others surrendered to time. The street felt real in a way nothing else had. Across the road, a mailbox held a folded paper visible through the slot. A single year written in bold ink. 2025, Ben swallowed. We're not in the past, he said. It's 20 years later. The word stopped short, unfinished. Chloe finished them for him. Then we didn't survive, she said. We stayed. The house behind them groaned softly, settling into itself. 4 young people stood in the place where their lives had ended, realizing the truth too late. They weren't visitors. They were what remained. Jessica shook her head, refusing to let the thought take root. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. They were still sealed inside that concrete box, still breathing poison, still slipping away. What they were seeing had to be a dying mind's last illusion. They needed to go back. They needed to. Her words unraveled as soon as she spoke them. Back to where? To a steel room that had already claimed them. To bodies that should have been dust by now. Mike laughed softly, that same hollow sound that didn't belong in a living throat. He told them this wasn't the first time. It had been happening for years, decades maybe. Time didn't behave the same for them anymore. Sometimes days passed, sometimes weeks. Then it always returned to the same beginning, the crash of glass, the rush to hide, the vote. One of them chosen, the door opening, the truth revealed, and then nothing, a reset, another Halloween, again and again. Ben rejected it outright. They remembered their lives, school, family, growing up. Dead people didn't remember things like that. Mike asked him to prove it. Not generally, not vaguely, one clear memory, a real one, a day, a conversation, a moment that didn't involve this house. Ben tried. He reached inward and found only fog. He knew he had parents, but their faces wouldn't come. He remembered attending classes, but no names surfaced, no voices, no details. The memories felt flat, like pictures in a book he'd never opened. Mike nodded. That's because this is the only thing that's real anymore, he said. This night, This place. Everything else is just scenery. Chloe stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring upward as if expecting someone to descend. She spoke about the judge, the one who lived here before them. The landlord had said he'd used the room once. What if that was the trap? What if the room didn't just hide people, but held them? What if it taught them how to repeat? Jessica moved to the window and wiped grime from the glass with her sleeve. The street outside was empty, overgrown, forgotten. No one was coming. No one ever would. This house had been avoided for 20 years. Ben felt a fragile spark of hope rise in his chest. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe if no one ever locked themselves in that room again, the cycle would end. Maybe that's how they could finally stop. Mike offered a quieter, crueler thought. Maybe even this realization was part of it. Maybe understanding was just another step on the track, another marker before the world folded in on itself again. Maybe soon they'd wake in their beds, young and terrified, hearing glass shatter below. Maybe there was no exit at all. They stood there, in a house that no longer belonged to the living, facing the possibility that insight brought no release, that knowledge didn't unlock doors, that they were bound to relive the same fear, the same mistake, the same slow death forever, with only brief moments of borrowed life in between. And the house listened, patient as it had always been, waiting for the next beginning. The light outside began to change. Ben noticed it first, the way the afternoon glow slipped into amber, then bled into red, then sank into that heavy violet that only comes right before night. The colors felt deliberate, seasonal, like the world itself was dressing for the date. Halloween shades painted across the windows. The timing was so precise it almost felt like a joke. Chloe broke the quiet. Her voice was barely there, but steady. She said she wouldn't go back to the room. Not again. Even if everything reset. Even if they forgot this moment and relived the terror from the beginning. She couldn't be in that concrete box anymore. So they stayed. Darkness finished its work outside, and the house accepted it without protest. No lights came on. There was no power, and none of them had brought their phones upstairs from the basement. Assuming phones even mattered anymore. Assuming objects followed rules for people like them. They sat on the dusty foyer floor and waited. Nothing came. Time passed, or something like it. The night grew thicker. Through the filthy windows they watched streetlights blink to life one by one. Cars rolled past now and then. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary world continuing exactly as it always had, untouched by the four wrong souls sitting inside a house that should have been empty. Jessica wondered aloud if this was the answer. What if they just stayed here? What if avoiding the basement was enough to stop it? No room, no lock, no reset. Ben offered the darker thought. What if this was already part of it? What if believing they'd escaped was the trap? What if, in a few hours, memory would drain away and they'd wake upstairs again, hearts racing, glass shattering below? Mike had drifted into sleep, or whatever passed for it now. His breathing was thin but even. The fever seemed gone, or maybe fever no longer applied. Maybe the wound, the infection, the weakness had all been props, necessary steps in a story that no longer needed them. Chloe stood. She said she was going to her room. If they were stuck here, looped, trapped, forgotten, she wanted to see it once more. Just to know it existed. They listened as she climbed the stairs. Footsteps moving down the hallway, a door opening. Then nothing. Ben and Jessica remained in the foyer, sitting side by side. The old newspaper lay between them, its brittle pages spread open. The date stared back like an accusation. 20 years. A lifetime stolen so quietly it almost felt polite. They would have been in their 40s by now. Careers, lives, maybe families, maybe children who never existed. Futures erased in a basement while they waited for danger to pass, breathing death and calling it safety. The house stood around them exactly as it always had, silent, patient, unchanged. While outside, the world moved on without ever knowing they'd been left behind. Jessica tried to remember her parents. She knew they had existed, not as people anymore, but as a concept. Two figures who should have weight and faces and voices. Instead, her memories of them were washed thin, like old photos left too long in sunlight. She couldn't picture her mother's face at all now, couldn't recall the exact sound of her voice. The only version that remained was wrong, warped, and metallic, carried through a vent. Ben felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air. He asked what she'd heard in the panic room. "My mom," Jessica said, through the vents, saying what I kept texting her. She paused. "I never called her. I kept saying I would, after the essay, after the deadline, tomorrow." A humorless breath escaped her. Tomorrow never came, did it? 20 years, and she never called. Ben offered something that might have been kindness, or might have been the truth. Maybe forgetting was mercy. Maybe if they remembered everything clearly, it would crush them. Maybe the mind was protecting what little remained. Jessica shook her head slowly. She offered a darker thought. "Maybe we're forgetting because we're finally disappearing," she said. "Maybe this isn't a loop. Maybe this is just ending. Maybe this is what fatting looks like." The idea should have terrified him. Instead, Ben felt an unexpected calm settle in his chest. To thin out, to dissolve, to stop lingering in this half-existence where nothing truly changed and nothing truly ended. Perhaps ghosts weren't meant to last. Perhaps they'd simply overstayed. A sound came from upstairs. Movement, then Chloe's voice drifting down the stairwell. She told them to come up, said they needed to see something. Ben helped Jessica to her feet. They climbed the stairs together, slow and careful, like the house might object if they moved too quickly. They followed the hallway to Chloe's room. The door was open. Chloe stood by the window. The room was almost untouched. The ceiling showed signs of water damage and dust lay thick across every surface, but everything else was still there. Books lined the shelf. A laptop sat on the desk, closed, obsolete, fossilized. A Vermeer poster clung stubbornly to the wall, its corners curled and yellowed with age. It felt less like a bedroom and more like an exhibit. A college student's room, circa 2005. Chloe pointed outside. The window looked out over the backyard and beyond it the neighboring street. Houses stood close together. Lights glowed warmly behind curtains. In some windows, people moved, setting tables, washing dishes, sinking into couches. Someone laughed. Someone lived. "So close." "We're right here," Chloe said quietly. "We could walk over, knock on a door." Jessica shook her head. "They wouldn't see us." "We don't know that," Chloe replied. "What if they could? What if we warned them, told them not to rent this house, not to use that room?" Ben felt the weight of another possibility settle over the room. "Or maybe that's how it spreads," he said. "We warn them, we draw attention to the house, make it curious, make it interesting, enough that someone wants to move in, enough that someone wants to feel safe." They stood at the window, watching lives unfold a few yards away, dinners cooked, televisions glowing, nights beginning. The living world brushed right past them without slowing, without noticing. And somewhere deep in the house, unseen and patient, The panicked room waited. Living, and Ben felt it fully now, the distance. Not space, not time, but a deeper separation. The living world was right there, glowing behind windows, breathing and moving, and they were excluded from it completely. They were no longer participants. They were leftovers, residue, awareness without weight, thoughts without bodies. Maybe there had never been a loop. Maybe this was simply what came after for people who died afraid and confused. Not fire, not judgment, just endless consciousness pressed up against a world they could never touch again. Forever close, forever barred. Mike appeared in the doorway. He swayed as he stood there, unsteady, as if gravity itself wasn't sure whether it applied to him anymore. In the weak orange light spilling in from outside, his face looked old. Not wrinkled, not aged in the usual way, just worn, ancient with repetition. And yet he was still 20 years old. He would always be 20 years old. "It's starting," Mike said. They listened. At first there was nothing. Then faintly from far below, a sound reached them. Glass breaking. Ben felt something seize inside his chest. He wasn't even sure he still had a heart, but the reaction was automatic, instinctive, burned too deep to erase. The sound was exact, identical, the same pitch, the same sharp violence. The beginning. "No," Jessica whispered. "No, they're not doing this again." But the house answered her. Footsteps in the foyer. Voices, low, muffled, unfamiliar. The careful, methodical movement of people who didn't belong there, moving through a house they believed was empty. Ben saw it then, or thought he did, or remembered seeing it. The difference no longer mattered. The dust on Chloe's floor began to move. Not stirred, not blown. It pulled itself backward. Grains slid across the wood as if time itself were revering, thinning, gathering, retreating into nothing. In the corners, the heavy curtains of webbing began to draw in, strand by strand, collapsing into themselves. The room seemed to inhale. On the wall, the Vermeer poster shifted. The yellowing at its edges faded. The image sharpened, colors deepening, as though it were being restored before their eyes. "Look at your hands," Mike said. Ben did. His fingers were changing. The translucence receded. Warmth returned. Color filled the skin. He felt a heartbeat, strong, undeniable, thudding in his chest. Had it been gone before? He couldn't remember. The house was rewinding. 20 years of neglect unraveling, peeling away like a bad dream dissolving in morning light. Time stuttered, struggled, tried to snap back into place. But then Ben looked down again. The dust was still there. The poster was still yellow. His hands were still faint, half transparent. Reality flickered, unable to decide which version of itself was real. The reset was failing. The machinery of the haunting strained, grinding against resistance it had never faced before. "It's trying to pull us back," Chloe said. Her eyes were fixed on her desk. The laptop shimmered, there 1 second gone the next. New and pristine, then suddenly ancient and buried under decades of dust. Present and past fighting for dominance in the same space. "It's trying to make us forget again." That was the true horror. Not dying, not repeating, but losing this moment first. Being dragged backward into ignorance, back into minds that didn't know they were already dead, back into fear that felt fresh every time. A cycle that erased understanding before it erased memory. A loop that would always feel like the first time. Forever. In Jessica's hand, her phone flickered. The screen lit up. 2:47 a.m. October 31st, 2005. Then the display died. Then it lit again. 2:47 a.m. The house creaked below them. Footsteps grew closer, voices sharpened. Glass crunched under shoes. And the night prepared to begin again. Dead and useless only moments ago, now alive again with light. The message burned on the screen. Call me when you can, sweetie. Love you. The house shuddered around them, rebuilding itself piece by piece, trying to rewind to the exact second everything had gone wrong. Walls groaned, floorboards tightened. Time strained forward and backward at once, stalling like a machine grinding stripped gears. This reset wasn't clean. It was choking. Footsteps rose on the staircase, slow, steady, inevitable. Each step landed with purpose, with the calm confidence of something that had done this before and knew exactly how it ended. Mike's eyes gleamed too brightly, fever-lit. He whispered about defiance, about refusing the script, about breaking cycles. But Ben felt the pull anyway. A horrible magnetism tugged at his thoughts, his muscles, his instincts. His body already knew the route. Turn left, down the hall, stairs, basement, run. The ritual was trying to reclaim him. Before it could, Jessica moved. She stepped toward the light spilling down the hallway. Jessica, Ben reached for her, panic tearing his voice loose, but she slipped from his grasp. Her phone was still in her hand. Her mother's message glowed softly, stubbornly real. Jessica walked forward, straight toward the sweeping beam of a flashlight, toward the figures searching the house. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. For the first time in 20 years, she moved against the grain of the story. Not running, approaching. The beam found her. It locked onto her chest, her face, holding her in stark white glare. She stood still, arms at her sides, breathing evenly, as if she were stepping into judgment or salvation. Then the light went out. Not into darkness, into clarity. The flashlight hit the floor, clattering uselessly, and in the space it had illuminated, Jessica finally saw him. A firefighter, full gear, helmet scar, face shield smeared with soot. His eyes were bloodshot, raw with exhaustion and smoke. He flickered, transparent, unstable, less a person than a memory carved so deeply into the world it refused to fade. He didn't see her. She knew that instantly. His gaze passed straight through her, fixed on the concrete wall behind her, the sealed panic room door. Steel reinforced, too strong, too late. His mouth was moving. His voice echoed from far away, warped by time. "We're trying," he was shouting. "We're trying." He gestured frantically, urgency burning through every motion. The doors reinforced. "We need the hydraulic spreader. Now, move. There are 4 kids in there." Behind him, more figures materialized. EMTs hauling equipment at a run. Another firefighter swinging an axe again and again at a wall that refused to break. Police shouting into radios, cordoning off space that no longer mattered. They were frantic, desperate, fighting a clock that had already stopped. They had never been intruders. They had never been the threat. They had been there the whole time, trying to get them out. They weren't enemies. They never had been. They were men and women who had come running when the alarms went silent. People who had thrown their bodies against concrete and steel, who had shouted until their throats tore raw, who had broken tools and knuckles, and time itself trying to reach 4 terrified students hiding on the other side of a door. And they had failed. Not from neglect, not from cruelty. From minutes that slipped away, while fear made the wrong choice feel like the safest one. Jessica spoke, even though she knew the words would never land. She apologized anyway, for the silence, for the mistrust, for mistaking hope for danger. The firefighter's shoulders sagged. His hand dropped from the wall. He turned to the EMT behind him, his posture saying everything his mouth couldn't anymore. It was the body language of loss when effort has nowhere left to go. Ben stepped beside Jessica, then Chloe, then Mike, swaying but still standing. The four of them lined the hallway, watching the rescue that had always been there, finally understanding the meaning of the pounding, the voices, the urgency in every shout through the vents. "We know you're in there. Hold on. We're coming." But they hadn't held on. They had gone quiet in the dark, convinced that survival meant sealing themselves away from the very hands trying to pull them out. The firefighter looked up once more, just for a heartbeat. Impossible, yet undeniable, his eyes seemed to settle on Jessica, on the glow of the phone in her hand, on the message that had waited 20 years to be seen. Something softened in his expression, not relief, not victory, something closer to acceptance. The understanding that some stories end in loss no matter how fiercely you fight the ending. Then he faded. The EMTs vanished, the axes stilled, the shouting drained out of the air. October 31st, 2005 dissolved, leaving only the ruined hallway of 2025 behind. This time, the house did not rewind. The dust stayed where it was. The webs clung stubbornly to corners. The curled poster did not heal. The machinery of repetition had jammed. The lights went out, not violently, not suddenly, but into a silence so complete it felt like release. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Ben felt it. The house felt hollow, as if the walls were loosening their grip, as if the space itself were opening, no longer insisting on being a place where something had to happen again. A hand found his in the dark. Then another. 4 presences linked, standing where a hallway used to matter. The darkness thin, not bright, not light, just less weight, less hold. They were fading too, not disappearing in fear, but loosening, edges softening, becoming something unbound. Chloe asked if this was the end. Her voice sounded far away, stretched thin across distance that hadn't existed before. Ben didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jessica had stepped forward instead of hiding. She had faced the truth instead of running from it. And in doing so, she had cracked the loop wide enough for all of them to fall through. One by one, they drifted. Mike first, his face calm at last, the fever light gone, his breathing no longer borrowed from a script. Chloe followed, smiling faintly, like someone who had finally caught the meaning of a joke told far too long ago. Jessica turned back once, just once, meeting Ben's eyes. Then she was gone too. Then there was nothing. Then there was everything. The panic room sat empty. Its door hung open. The generator was cold and silent. The lights never flickered back on. The supplies remained untouched, waiting for hands that would never come. Upstairs, the abandoned house settled into itself. No footprints disturbed the dust. No webs were broken. The newspaper in the foyer yellowed a little more, aging quietly. Outside, the street lived on. Day into night, night into day. And somewhere between memory and forgetting, between fear and understanding, 4 students who had died believing they were protecting themselves finally stopped reliving their last mistake. The house stood still. The room waited. And whatever had been holding on let go.